Heading south of the Mason-Dixon, this is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 305, covering the week of April 18th through April 22nd, 2022. Glad to have you back in the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. You can find all those social media accounts at our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. That's A-B-B-E-V-I-L-L-E, institute.org. While you're there, give us an email address. We'll give you a free ebook, Exploring the Southern Tradition by 20 Abbeville Institute scholars. It's our gift to you just for giving us that email address. And of course, the email list is how we keep in touch with you. Now, let me say something about that. If you want to get our emails, make sure you whitelist the Abbeville Institute. We know there's been some problems with places like Yahoo and Apple blocking our emails. So make sure you go out there and whitelist us. Make sure that we can have access to your email inbox. That's how we let you know about our programs. That's how we let you know about our articles. This is how we keep in touch with you. Of course, when we talk about programs, we have our summer school coming up, July 5th through 8th at Seabrook Island, South Carolina. It's going to be a great program. The title is The Southern Tradition. We've got a lot of great material there for that. So if you want more information about that, just go to our website, click on the events tab, and you can find information about that. Also, we do our webinars, our Zoom webinars. Now, we don't have one coming up until May, but you'll find out about those through the email list. So if you want to get all of our old Zoom webinars, just go to abbevilleacademy.org. You can purchase any of those old Zoom webinars. If you've already purchased them and you've attended those webinars, you should have a free replay in your email inbox again. So make sure you look for that. It'll be under the subject replay, and enroll in those replays of those webinars that you paid for already. Also, if you click on the support tab or donate button at abbevilleinstitute.org, you can give us a tax-deductible donation. That's how we exist. So if you like what we do, if you like the podcast, everything we do, the website, the webinars, the conferences, consider a tax-deductible donation to the Institute. Also, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Let people know you like it. That's how we keep it going. You can download our free mobile app. There's all kinds of ways to support the Institute. Get our apparel by clicking on the shop tab. And of course, word of mouth is best. So if you like any of our articles, if you like anything we do here, make sure you share it around on social media. That's how people know what we're doing. We are not on Facebook, but you can still share our material on Facebook. So that's a great way to let your friends know about our material. So let's talk about the material for this week. We had a lot of good stuff. One of the things that I think is always interesting in the South, and this has been this way for a long time, politically, the South has always been a very unified area. There, of course, are always pockets in the South where you don't have people of the same opinion. And nowadays, when you look at the urban-rural split in places like Georgia, Atlanta's one thing and then the rest of Georgia's another. Even in, Alabama, you've got pockets of Alabama that tend to vote one way and then the rest of the state votes the rest. You have this throughout Texas. You've got your pockets of, blue areas. You've certainly got it in North Carolina, Virginia. All of your southern states have these different pockets of not like-minded Southerners, right? So, or in many cases now they're just transplants from the North. That's an issue in the South. But generally the South has always been the solid South. When you look at party control of these states, and you start talking about in the antebellum period, it was the Democrats. There's some places, even after the antebellum period, it was always the Democrats. Up until about the 1970s when you started seeing the Republican Party become ascendant in the South. But the South generally has a one-party dominance. Now, this is interesting because that party then, and the party apparatus, will be on everyone's mind at all times. So there's this perception in the South that if just this party was in power, everything would be okay. And so we talk about that. A lot of Southerners talk about this today with, the national, quote-unquote, national elections, whether it's Joe Biden or the Congress or what's going on. And they think, well, if just the Republicans could gain control of the Congress, or if Republicans could be in the White House, everything would be okay in the United States. And if we use history as a guide in this way, in the Southern tradition, and look at these things, this is not going to be the case at all, particularly in the 20th century. This is why George Wallace said there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties. This is why George Wallace had so much impact in the United States in national elections, because he was able to show, I think, conclusively that both parties were in the same boat together, and they were rowing the same way. Just one, actually, they weren't the same boat. They're on the same river, though. One's rowing a little faster than the other, but that's it. That's the only difference. And so Wallace was trying to row against the current. He was trying to go the other way. And you've seen this throughout American history as the South, and you start looking at South Carolina, and you go back to the Jackson administration, and you start looking at how South Carolina voted against everyone else in a couple of presidential elections, right? With John Floyd and White, who was one of their, they nominated and voted for electoral college votes for a man named White. This was South Carolina going against the current. And South Carolina in 1860 would have seceded on its own had no one else been involved in the process. Now, certainly they wanted the other southern states to get on board with secession, but they would have done it their way anyways. I mean, you look at nullification, they went their way. So there's always been in certain parts of the South this desire to go their own way and do their own thing, to row against the current, because they look at it and say, there's not a dime's worth of difference between Andrew Jackson and his opponents, because they're all establishments. I mean, Jackson is going to use federal power just as his opponents would use federal power. What's the difference? It's just that Jackson sounds a little better. Jackson sounds a little more like Jefferson, but he doesn't really govern like Jefferson. And I think this is where Southerners started to see this. And certainly you had this in New England as well, as New Englanders would look at the situation, and they would buck trends at times. But this is something that we're looking at now. What would happen if the Republicans controlled Congress or the presidency or anything else? I mean, we saw that for 4 years. Spending was up. Government power was up. I mean, nothing really changed. In fact, government just got bigger. There was more spending. Nothing really changed. If you're a Southern conservative and you look at the situation, you say, gosh, I mean, there's not really much here. It's just that now spending is up. Government power is up. The only difference is we don't have a guy in there that's mean tweeting all the time. So, but in terms of power, all of these people, whether they're Republicans, whether they're Democrats, believe in the power of the central government. They believe in the power of the central authority, and they're going to use it to pass unconstitutional legislation. They're going to use it to do things to infringe on the original Constitution. This is why when we talk at the Abbeville Institute about culture and tradition, these things matter. These things matter because that's how you turn things around. You have to start smaller and work your way out. And I think a lot of Southerners realize this. You go back to 1930, and I'll take my stand. This is what they're talking about, regionalism. How can we combat unconstitutional federal power? How can we combat the destruction of Southern culture and Southern tradition, or at large, the Jeffersonian tradition and Jeffersonian America? How can we combat this? Well, in their mind, you had to start small and you had to work regionally, and it was from the bottom up. There's never going to be a solution from the top down. I know people have dabbled with this, even, wow, if we just get this guy in office, or we get this person in office, we just do this or do that, everything's going to turn around, everything's going to be better. But generally, we've seen one long march towards more and more centralization in America, and it begins in the 1860s. And, I mean, I can make a case it begins before that, but really takes on its own form in the 1860s. The Republican Party was very open about this. They want to nationalize everything. And from there, we just keep moving in that direction over and over and over again. So this is where we have a situation in America where the Republicans winning. This is the piece by Paul Yarborough on Monday. Red waves, so what? The Republicans winning is not going to change a whole lot. The way that it has to work, and this is what we talked about with Michael Bolden on our Zoom webinar last week. The way it has to work is that we have to, or a couple of weeks ago, I'm sorry, back at the beginning of April. The way it has to work is that we have to work from the bottom up and work through our state apparatus. This is what Southerners recognize. They realize this. They realize this is the only way to combat unconstitutional federal power, is to work in that direction. So I like this piece by Paul Yarborough because he's pointing out something that Southerners have been realizing now in the 20th century for nearly 60, 70 years. It's not going to make a difference if we control the apparatus of the central authority. Now, on the other hand, You can go back and look at how much power Southerners actually did have in the general government for years through the central authority. People like Richard Russell and others. I mean, they were certainly very powerful individuals in the general government. I mean, you can even say, Lyndon Johnson, whether you like his programs or not, he's a Southerner, and he had a lot of control, a lot of power. And so he's certainly using that influence to his advantage in government. So Southerners have long had a monopoly on power in Washington. I think that's waning a little bit. But this is where the left nowadays gets very upset because they see the South, again, as a complete hindrance to good government. There was a tweet the other day by Michael Beschloss, who's a leftist historian, who said, would it have been better if we just let the South go? Would America have been better? And this is a question that I think people are starting to ask now. And when we've made politics a religion in America, which is what Lincoln was doing. He was elevating politics to a religion. He essentially said it. And when he's saying that reason becomes important, you go back and you look at, there's a speech Lincoln made where he talks about reason. And you think about what was happening in the French Revolution. They had the Church of Reason, right? So Lincoln was a French revolutionary. There's little doubt about this. But when you go back and look at the Philadelphia Convention and you look at what happens there in 1787, and we have the reasonable people trying to say we need more centralization, we need more government power, et cetera, and you have John Dickinson, who was from Pennsylvania but also had a plantation in Delaware. He was a Quaker, but in many ways had a lot of traits that would make him very Southern. He was a planter. He stood up and said, experience has to be our only guide. Reason may mislead us. So as we look at the Southern tradition, and as we look at the South, it has to be experience and tradition that are leading us, not reason, because reason can get you in trouble. We saw it in the French Revolution. We saw it in the Second American Revolution, which is the war in 1860s. It was a real revolution, and it wasn't the South that was engaging in a revolution. It was the North that was engaging in a revolution at that point. They were revolutionizing America. And again, whether you like that revolution or not, this is what was happening. They were revolutionizing the economy. They were revolutionizing the social structure. They were revolutionizing politics in America. They were doing all of those things, revolutionizing diplomacy. It was at that point that the Republican Party started saying, hey, look, if we're going to change America here, well, can't the rest of the world benefit from our liberty and democracy? Can't the rest of the world be better because of what we're doing? And of course, that becomes their drive from that point forward to press this American ideal of liberty and democracy. So I think when you look at that post by Yarborough, it gets into that. And then when you talk about tradition, this piece by Tom Fleming, Kith and Kin, The Enduring Ethic of the South. And this is a transcription from a lecture he gave at one of our summer schools, 2016, 6 years ago now. But he gave this lecture, and it's a fantastic look at place. And I think that's the thing that has always been so important in the Southern tradition. It's place. In my own podcast, if you don't get that, it's the Brian McClanahan Show. It's Monday through Thursday. Just go out there and look for the Brian McClanahan Show wherever you get your podcast. But I talked about this. I talk about this a lot, actually. But how important place is and why. And I had a show where I talked about, would young people defend the United States? And my point was that they would defend the United States if it was their state, if it was their community, and they should. Should they defend some abstraction of the United States? Overseas, going to fight overseas? No. They should defend their place, their community, their kith and kin. They should defend, as Tom Fleming points out, where their people are buried. And you think about that process of burying, and it's something that I think a lot of Americans don't really pause and reflect on anymore. But where you bury your people is where you're tied to, because there's always going to be a draw back to that place, that name on that marker. Those are the people that are here. And they're permanently, they've become a part of the landscape. And so you have these little small cemeteries throughout the United States, and throughout the South, and you have these little family plots and other things. You drive around, you see them, and I know there's other parts of the United States that does this too, but in the South, you had all these little family plots all over the place. And that's where your people are buried. It's still a communication. You're still communing with these people long after they're gone because they become a permanent feature of the landscape. They're not, it's not just they're gone. And this is where, when you look at, our efforts now in modern America, and more people are getting cremated, and they're no longer buried in a place. That's changed some things, right? Because as you bury your people somewhere, that is an important part, a tie to that land. And so when Fleming talks about kith and kin, and he talks about this is what it means, right? This tie, community, the family. That was an important part of the Southern tradition. And so, he brings up this old thing, what do you do and where you're from? But this is it's very Republican. I know a lot of people talk about that the South was oligarchic, right? It's oligarchic. It's very Republican, in fact, to have this paterfamilias, this idea of the family and the male-dominated family, more importantly, but also this connection to a place and a people. It's what the Romans had. It was this continuity between generations that they really built on. And of course, the English did it too. But there was certainly and the Germans, there was certainly that would eventually move into England. There was certainly a byproduct of these different traditions in Anglo-America, in the Anglo-Saxons, then into Anglo-America, of this connection to place. And going back to Rome. And this is why I think that we still need, and I talk about, when I said politically, it's that tradition that always has to trump politics. And this communal vision of rising and falling together. Now, Americans have had this. You look at the Declaration of Independence, which of course is a Southern document, but we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor to this. And Northerners signed that document too, but then you look at the piece we published on Wednesday, Common Cause and Common Fate. It was a speech by Lewis Stone, delivered January 9th, 1861. And he's talking about secession. And he's talking, look, it's Confederate Memorial Month, right? And one thing I want to say about that is that the South is more than just 4 years of history. And it's fun to talk about that period of time. And sometimes it's difficult to talk about that period of time for a variety of reasons. But it has to be said, of course, that the South is bigger than 4 years. It's 400 years. We've said this a lot on this program. It's 400 years. But in April, we often reflect on that 4-year period of independence and what that meant for America, what that meant for the South, what that meant overall for everybody involved. But one of the common misconceptions about that period is that the South were warmongers. They were just looking for a fight. They were itching for it. They just wanted to go attack the United States. And I think the evidence is all on the other side. And you look at this speech by Lewis Stone at the Alabama Secession Convention, delivered it January 9th, 1861. Now, of course, I'll say this about Lewis Stone. A lot of people will cite another speech that he made where he talks about the closing of the African slave trade, and he was fully in accordance with that, but for reasons that would be unpalatable to the modern ear. It was a very racist speech, and he talked about the blessings of slavery and the expansion of slavery into South America. And this, for the left, this is it. I mean, this is the Holy Grail. They've figured it out. It's all about slavery. But when you look at this speech that he makes on January 9th, 1861, he says, Mr. President, I fully concur with the gentleman from Montgomery, Mr. Yancey, in the propriety of immediately passing the resolution now under consideration. All the powers of the state of Alabama should be pledged to aid in resisting any attempt to coerce a seceding state back into the Union. So look at how he's phrasing this. The powers of Alabama should be used to keep force from being used to put a seceding state back in the Union. Now, look at what's happening around the world now. When people looking at Ukraine, right? I mean, so the argument is that we should use force to keep Russia from forcing Ukraine back into a union with Russia. But the same people that would be on board with that would oppose this. Right? Now, the Ukrainian situation, there's all kinds of complexities that's entirely, there's many different facets of that. But, because there's also the region of Ukraine that would like to secede from Ukraine and join Russia. So, there's that part of it too. And we've talked about that at the Abbeville Institute since 2014. We had a post on that a long time ago. Way back, we started talking about that. So he continues, "Sir, the southern states recognize the right of secession. It constitutes the very essence of state sovereignty and is inseparable from it. A state is the best and sole judge of her own grievances. As a party, the federal compact must herself decide in the last resort, as well as of the infraction as of the mode and measures of redress. If in her sovereign capacity she determines to resume her independence, can we, who have a common interest in the protection of this right, look calmly on and see her invaded by federal soldiers?" Now think about that again. So the state determines to resume her independence. So can we look on and say we should partake in forcing a party back into a union it doesn't want to be part of? So the convention which framed our Constitution expressly refused to grant to the general government the power to employ force against the state. This was actually, he's 100% right about this. In fact, during the ratification process, this was brought up. That states could not be coerced in their political capacity. They couldn't be. It was illegal. The states came into the Union free and sovereign and independent. They have never parted with their freedom or sovereignty. They established a government to act as their agent, and now, to permit that agent to employ force against the states would be to sanction the grossest usurpation. It will be converting the government into a despotism. Sir, the Union was never intended to be preserved by force. The fact that the power to employ force against a state was refused in the convention which framed the Constitution proves that those who constructed our government knew that it could not be maintained by force. Of what value would the Union be if the states composing it had to be reduced to obedience by the strong arm of military power? Let me stop there. Is it not the same as what Britain was trying to do to the states in 1776? Absolutely. What value would that union be if you're coerced into it? Then it becomes not a voluntary union, but a forced association. And the Constitution was a voluntary union. No longer is it voluntary when you're forced. That's why this speech is so good. The permanence and security of our government depend alone upon the principle of common affection and common interest. Force is the last argument of kings. It cannot keep these states together. Notice what he did there. He brings up kings, right? So King Lincoln, King Abraham. The permanence and security of our government depend alone upon the principle of common affection and common interest. That's what I brought up. So why would young people today support an abstraction? They would support tradition, their state, where their people are buried, their community, but would they support some abstraction of the United States? Well, Stone is saying they shouldn't. If then we recognize the right of secession and intend to maintain that right against any power that may resist its exercise, why not so declare by passing this resolution? This course will give encouragement to our Southern sisters. It will give strength to the Southern cause. It may secure peace. If the government at Washington is informed that the coercive policy with which South Carolina is now threatened will be resisted, and that the first federal gun fired against Charleston will summon to the field every Southern man who can bear arms, it may produce a peaceful solution of the pending difficulties. If it should not, then the responsibility will rest alone upon our assailants. All we can now do is to warn them against the madness of attempted coercion. Now, think about what he just said there. It's often phrased and framed that the South instigated the war. But we know, as we talked about with John Marquardt's piece last week, one of our resident scholars in Japan, we know that Lincoln made the first move. And Pickens is key to that. Not just Sumter, but Pickens, because Pickens was being reinforced when there was a long stalemate there, and it was basically a gentleman's agreement. You don't reinforce the area, we don't do anything about it. Nobody's going to shoot at each other. We're just going to say, you leave it alone while we're negotiating what happens here. So when Lincoln sends troops to reinforce Pickens, that is an act of aggression. By sending a resupply into Fort Sumter, as Winfield Scott pointed out, if you do this, it's going to cause war because it is an act of aggression. You are saying we're not giving up these forts. We're going to resupply them, and we're going to ensure that our men have provisions to resist anything you want to do, and we're not selling it. Your act is illegal. That was an act of aggression. It may not have been a shot, but it was a de facto shot. And so the South responded. But now what Stone is saying, if you do this, the guilt, the responsibility alone rests upon your shoulders, Lincoln. This is why you can say Lincoln started the war. Now, the common rebuttal to that is, well, yeah, but he didn't shoot at anybody. There was no shots fired. The South fired the shots. The South leveled the fort, but didn't kill anybody. They, in fact, told him it was going to happen. Look, we're going to fire on the fort. Get out. We're not going to kill you. Come on shore. No big deal. And have a big, we're going to slap backs and have champagne. And here we go. You go back north and we're good. It wasn't the kind of aggression that you would see later on in the war. And even in Florida now, there was a little more, it was more intense down there. I mean, certainly. But regardless, the act of aggression was on Lincoln. And he knew it. And the cabinet knew it. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew it. Stone concludes, we wish peace. We do not intend to provoke war. We shall act on the defensive. Now, that's not warmongering. That's saying we don't want to fight. We just want to leave the Union in peace. Just let us go. And you shouldn't force us back in. But he says, but if war is forced upon us, our enemies should know that the southern states, whose rights, whose honor, and whose independence are alike at stake, intend to stand side by side in the contest, prepared to make common cause and to meet one common fate. It's kind of the same statement of the Declaration of Independence. So that's often said, well, why do these guys have a Declaration of Independence? They were saying a lot of the same language, right? So Stone here is saying that. And I think that's important to understand about this. The piece on Thursday by Valerie Protopappas is a piece entitled Triumph and Subjugation, and how the South, it's a very short piece, we had several short pieces this week, how the South has been subjugated by the North over the years. She said in 1935, Lion Gardner Tyler, descendant of 10th President John Tyler, in fact his son, wrote, quote, the old Union was a union of consent. The present Union is one of force. This is what Stone was saying. For many years after the war, the South was held as a subject province, and any privileges it now enjoys are mere concessions from its conquerors, not rights inherited from the Constitution. The North after the war had in domestic rule a whip which England never had over Ireland. To escape from it, the South became grateful for any kind of government. The present Union is a great northern nation based on force and controlled by northern majorities, to which the South, as a conquered province, has had to conform all its policies and ideals. The federal authority is only northern authority. As of today, the executive, the cabinet, the Supreme Court, the ministers at foreign courts are all northern men. The South has as little share in the government as little chance of furnishing a president as Norway or Switzerland. So, what he's saying is that the North has subjugated the South and it controls everything. Now, this is 1935. One thing I can say about that, and actually she continues, she says, of course, a so-called Southern president was elected even before Tyler's statement, Woodrow Wilson. But Southern presidents like Wilson, LBJ, who murdered his way into the White House, and Bill Clinton embraced policies and ideals that were those of the Northern conqueror. As for the so-called Southern conservatives who bemoan federal tyranny and point to the likes of FDR, LBJ, and Obama for bringing about the present tyranny, the fact is they must look further back in history to understand when the control of the national over the Union of States created by the founders was put into final complete effect. Even Lincoln's war was only the culmination of an ongoing contest between the founders' representative republic, with its limited government acting with the consent of the governed, and a centralized national democracy, a contest that began before the ink on the Constitution had dried. No wonder men like Virginia patriot Patrick Henry rejected the Constitution. Henry could see the seeds of tyranny within the fine words and sentiments expressed in that now virtually defunct document. And so this is true. I mean, you can go back all the way to the first administration. I've often said, when did the Constitution die? Well, 1789, when the first Judiciary Act was passed, because that made it to where the federal courts were going to overrule the South at all times, because they could appeal state court decisions to the federal government. And that was it. And Virginia resisted this, by the way. Virginia tried. This was the Cohens v. Virginia case, which John Marshall smacked down the South smacked down Virginia because they were trying to block the ability of a state court decision to be appealed in federal court. So this is a very important thing, and this idea of subjugation and what happens. You get Stone talking about this, and you get Tyler talking about this. These are big issues, and I think if we don't understand the history behind these things, we are not fully grasping the weight of the situation. When you talk about American politics and you look at, well, this party's just in power, things are going to be better. We have a long-standing history of things not getting better just because Republicans in power or not. So that's why I like that piece. And of course, just mention the piece on Friday by Clyde Wilson, 20th part in his series on Southern poets and poems, William Gilmore Simms. Some really great stuff with Simms. If you're not reading Simms, you're not really reading the antebellum South. He was the first man of letters in the South, just a great writer. And of course, Poe recognized that. People knew Simms was great. He was only blacklisted later in the antebellum period because he was so fervently against the Uncle Tom's Cabin narrative of the South, and he wrote several essays and other things against that. So regardless, Simms is someone you should be reading if you want to understand the antebellum South. Okay, hope you enjoyed this Week in Review. Until next time, good day.